His throne was built on bones. Aurora Darasi had spent years pretending she was just a girl, not the daughter of a mafia king. But when she ran from a truth she was never meant to know, there was only one man who would never let her escape. Tommaso Benedetti stood in her doorway, his voice deceptively soft. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Now, you'll never leave again." Chapter 1. The Shattered Reflection of Innocence. The antique mirror, framed in ornate, tarnished silver, reflected a woman Aurora Darasi barely recognized. Not in the physical sense, of course. The face that stared back was undeniably hers, the same high cheekbones, the same slightly upturned nose, the same full lips that her mother always said were made for smiling. But the eyes, those were different. Gone was the carefree sparkle, the innocent glint that had defined Aurora for most of her 58 years. In their place was a haunted, hollow emptiness, a void carved out by a truth too brutal to comprehend. She traced the delicate lines etched around her eyes, the faint crow's feet that spoke of laughter and sunshine, now overshadowed by the deep furrows of worry creasing her brow. Her silver-streaked, dark hair, usually styled in a soft, elegant chignon, was loose, falling around her shoulders like a shroud. She looked old and tired, so profoundly, bone-achingly tired. The luxurious hotel suite, with its panoramic view of the rain-swept Roman skyline, felt like a gilded cage. The plush velvet curtains, the intricately patterned Persian rug, the crystal chandelier that dripped with shimmering light, none of it brought comfort. It was all a suffocating reminder of the life she had tried, so desperately, to escape. Just 3 days ago, Aurora had been Amelia Russo, a retired art history professor living a quiet, unassuming life in Florence. Her days were filled with the gentle rhythm of routine, morning coffee at her favorite cafe, afternoons spent sketching in the Boboli Gardens, evenings curled up with a good book and a glass of Chianti. Her biggest concern had been whether the wisteria on her balcony would bloom this year. Then, the letter arrived. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope, addressed in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Inside, a single sheet of thick, textured paper held a message that shattered her world. It was from her father. Not the gentle, academic father who had raised her, but her biological father. A man she had never known, a man whose name was synonymous with power, fear, and the shadowy underworld of the Italian Mafia, Donato Darasi. The letter, stark and unapologetic, laid bare a truth that had been meticulously concealed for almost 6 decades. Aurora was not Amelia Russo, the orphan daughter of 2 academics. She was Aurora Darasi, the only child of Donato Darasi, head of the powerful Darasi family, one of the most influential mafia clans in Italy. Her mother, a young, ambitious scholar, had become entangled with Donato, resulting in Aurora's birth. Fearing for her daughter's safety and horrified by the world she had glimpsed, she had fled, taking Aurora with her and assuming new identities, leaving behind a life of unimaginable privilege and terrifying danger. Aurora had spent the past 72 hours in a state of stunned disbelief, replaying her entire life, searching for clues, for any hint of the truth that had been so carefully hidden. The memories, once comforting and familiar, now felt tainted, distorted by this new, horrifying reality. Her mother's sudden, unexplained move from Rome to Florence when Aurora was 5. Her father's insistence on privacy, his reluctance to discuss their family history. The occasional, fleeting glimpses of dark-suited men watching their house from across the street, dismissed at the time as paranoia. It all made a sickening, twisted kind of sense now. She had tried to dismiss the letter as a cruel hoax, a twisted prank. But the details it contained, the intimate knowledge of her childhood, the specific mention of a small, silver locket her mother had always worn, containing a picture of a dark-haired, brooding man, it was all too precise, too personal to be fabricated. And then there was the crest. Embossed on the bottom of the letter, a stylized image of a rearing lion, its claws extended, its teeth bared. The Darasi family crest. She had seen it before, A fleeting glimpse on a gold ring worn by one of those shadowy men who had watched their house all those years ago. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Aurora had done the one thing she knew she shouldn't do. She had come to Rome. She had checked into this hotel, using a false name, and contacted the number listed at the bottom of the letter, a number that promised to connect her with someone. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the turmoil within her. The city lights blurred into a hazy, indistinct glow. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the room. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a lamb wandering into a den of wolves. A sharp knock on the door echoed through the suite, making her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped her. Another knock, more insistent this time. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She opened the door. A man stood in the hallway, silhouetted against the soft light of the corridor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the doorway. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, the fabric expensive and tailored to perfection. His face was in shadow, but she could sense the intensity of his gaze, the weight of his unspoken power. He stepped inside, the scent of expensive cologne, and something darker, something wilder, filling the air. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing like a death knell. He moved with a fluid grace, a predator's confidence that sent a shiver down her spine. As he stepped into the light, she saw his face. It was a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines. His eyes, a deep, unsettling shade of gray, seemed to pierce through her, stripping away her carefully constructed facade. His hair was dark, almost black, with a touch of silver at the temples, adding a distinguished, almost dangerous, edge to his appearance. There was a scar, a thin, white line that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a silent testament to a past filled with violence. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, judging. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a tremor through her. "Aurora Derasi," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't quite accusation, not quite welcome. It was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. He knew who she was. And in that instant, Aurora knew that her life, the quiet, peaceful life she had so carefully cultivated, was gone forever. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, a world of shadows and secrets, of loyalty and betrayal, a world where her very existence was a threat. And standing before her was a man who was clearly a part of that world, a man who held her fate in his hands. He took another step closer. She wanted to run, to do anything to escape that gaze. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice softer now, but no less dangerous. The words were almost a whisper, a secret shared between them. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Shadow of Legacy. His words hung in the air, a chilling counterpoint to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window panes. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, the softness in his voice doing nothing to diminish the underlying steel. It was the voice of a man accustomed to command, to obedience. A voice that spoke of power and the implicit threat that came with it. Aurora swallowed, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. I had to," she managed, her voice a shaky whisper that barely reached him across the expanse of the luxurious, yet suffocating, hotel suite. "I had to know if it was true." He raised a dark eyebrow, a silent question. His gaze, still fixed on her, was unnervingly intense, making her feel like a specimen under a microscope. He was studying her, dissecting her, searching for something she couldn't even name. "And now?" he asked, his voice still low, still laced with that unsettling undercurrent. "Do you believe it?" She hesitated. Part of her, the rational, logical part that had defined her life as Amelia Russo, still clung to the hope that it was all a mistake, a cruel deception. But the overwhelming weight of the evidence, the undeniable pull of this man's presence, the instinctive fear he inspired, it was all too compelling to ignore. I don't know what to believe, she admitted, the words a raw confession of her vulnerability. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. She could smell him now, that intoxicating blend of expensive cologne and something primal, something that spoke of danger and darkness. It was a scent that both repelled and intrigued her, a conflicting combination that mirrored her own tumultuous emotions. "My name is Tommaso Benedetti," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. "I was a close associate of your father." Associate. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Aurora knew enough about the Mafia, even from her deliberately sheltered life, to understand that associate was a euphemism, a polite term for something far more sinister. He wanted me to find you," Tommaso continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "He wanted to make amends." Make amends. Another euphemism. Aurora almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that died in her throat. How could a man like Donato de Rossi, a man who had built an empire on fear and violence, possibly make amends for abandoning his daughter, for condemning her to a life lived in the shadows? "Why?" she asked, the word barely audible. "Why now, after all these years?" Tommaso's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been regret, or perhaps just weariness, crossing his features. "He's dying," he said bluntly, the words devoid of any sentimentality. "He has regrets. He wants to see you." Before he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Aurora felt a strange mix of emotions, a cold, hard knot of anger, a flicker of pity for the dying man she had never known, and a deep, abiding fear of what this all meant for her. "And you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "Why are you doing this? What's your interest in all of this?" His lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Loyalty," he said simply. "Your father saved my life, many years ago. I owe him a debt I intend to repay. Loyalty. Debt." Words that belonged to a different world, a world of rigid codes and unbreakable bonds, a world that Aurora had only glimpsed from afar. A world she was now being inexorably drawn into. "And what if I refuse?" she asked, the question a challenge, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. "What if I want nothing to do with him, with any of this?" His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression that sent a shiver of fear through her. "You don't have a choice, Aurora," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "You are a de Rossi. That is a legacy you cannot escape, whether you like it or not." He moved closer again, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle rise and fall of his chest. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. She instinctively flinched, but he didn't touch her. "He wants to see you," Tommaso repeated, his voice softer now, almost a plea. "Just once. Before it's too late." Aurora looked into his eyes, those deep, gray eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets, of pain, of unspoken truths. She saw something there, something beyond the cold, hard exterior, something that resonated with her own hidden depths. A flicker of vulnerability, perhaps? Or maybe just the shared burden of a past they couldn't escape. She was trapped. She knew that. She had walked into a trap of her own making, driven by a desperate need for answers. But now, standing here, face to face with this man, this embodiment of the world she had always feared, she realized that she was also intrigued. There was a connection between them, a strange, inexplicable pull that defied logic and reason. It was a connection forged in the shadows, in the shared legacy of a past she was only beginning to understand. A connection that terrified her, and yet, at the same time, drew her in. The rain continued to fall, a relentless, melancholic rhythm that echoed the turmoil in her heart. She looked at Tommaso, at the hard lines of his face, the intensity of his gaze, the unspoken power that emanated from him. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had changed forever. "Take me to him," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm with a newfound resolve. The words were a surrender, but also a beginning. A step into the unknown, a journey into the heart of darkness. A journey she had to take, even if it meant facing the demons of her past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Chapter 3. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The drive was silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers against the rain-streaked windshield and the low hum of the powerful engine. Tommaso drove with a focused intensity, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't said a word since they left the hotel, leaving Aurora alone with her thoughts, a swirling vortex of fear, anticipation, and a strange, unsettling curiosity. The car, a sleek, black Maserati, was another reminder of the world she was entering. A world of luxury and power, of hidden dangers and unspoken threats. It was a world away from her battered, beloved Fiat 500, parked in her small garage in Florence, a relic of her former life, a life that now felt impossibly distant. She glanced at Tommaso, his profile stark and unyielding against the backdrop of the passing city lights. He was an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't quite decipher. He was clearly a dangerous man, a man who lived by a different code, a man who was comfortable with violence and deception. And yet, there was something else there, something that hinted at a depth, a complexity that she couldn't ignore. The scar on his face, a thin, white line that bisected his otherwise perfect features, was a constant reminder of his past, a past she was desperate to understand. She wondered how he had gotten it, what battles he had fought, what losses he had endured. She stole another glance at him, catching him watching her in the rearview mirror. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange that sent a shiver down her spine. He quickly looked away, his expression unreadable. The city lights gradually gave way to the dark, winding roads of the Roman countryside. They were heading towards the Castelli Romani, a cluster of picturesque towns nestled in the Alban Hills, southeast of Rome. It was an area known for its ancient villas, its lush vineyards, and its stunning views of the surrounding landscape. It was also, Aurora knew, a popular retreat for wealthy Romans, including those who preferred to keep their affairs discreet. The car slowed, turning off the main road and onto a long, private driveway lined with towering cypress trees. The trees, their dark, spiky silhouettes reaching towards the stormy sky, created a sense of foreboding, a feeling of entering a forbidden realm. At the end of the driveway, a massive villa came into view. It was an imposing structure, built of ancient stone, its walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and secretive. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, a place of hidden chambers and whispered secrets. Tommaso stopped the car in front of a pair of massive, wrought iron gates. He pressed a button on a small remote control, and the gates swung open silently, revealing a sprawling courtyard, paved with cobblestones and surrounded by manicured gardens. He parked the car in front of the main entrance, a towering wooden door, studded with iron and flanked by two stone lions, their faces eroded by time and weather, yet still retaining a menacing air. He turned to her, his expression still unreadable. "We're here," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Aurora felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. This was it. There was no turning back now. She was about to meet her father, the man who had haunted her dreams, the man who represented everything she had tried to escape. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She had to be strong. She had to face this, whatever it might bring. Tommaso got out of the car and came around to open her door. She stepped out, her legs feeling shaky and unsteady. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. He led her towards the entrance, his hand hovering just above her elbow, not quite touching her, but offering a silent reassurance, a subtle gesture of protection that surprised her. As they reached the door, it opened silently, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A woman stood just inside, her face etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She was middle-aged, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and dressed in a simple, black dress. She looked like a housekeeper, or perhaps a personal assistant, someone who was accustomed to managing the affairs of a powerful household. "Signor Benedetti," she said, her voice respectful, but tinged with a hint of nervousness. "He's waiting for you in the study." Tommaso nodded, his expression unchanged. "Thank you, Elena." He turned to Aurora, his gaze softening slightly. "This way," he said, gesturing towards the hallway. She followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was long and dimly lit, lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, presumably her ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax, a smell that evoked a sense of history, of tradition, of a lineage she was only now beginning to understand. They reached a pair of double doors, made of dark, polished wood. Tommaso paused, his hand resting on the ornate brass handle. He looked at Aurora, his gray eyes searching hers. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wasn't ready. She would never be ready. But she had to do this. He pushed open the doors, revealing a large, richly furnished study. The room was dominated by a massive, mahogany desk, covered in papers and books. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. And in the center of the room, sitting in a leather armchair facing the fire, was an old man. He was frail and thin, his skin pale and translucent, his hands gnarled and trembling. He was hooked up to various medical machines, their blinking lights and soft beeps a constant reminder of his failing health. This was Donato Derossi, her father, the man who had cast a shadow over her entire life, even without her knowing it. He turned his head, his eyes, still sharp and piercing despite his age and infirmity, fixing on Aurora. A flicker of recognition, of something that might have been emotion, crossed his face. He looked ancient, older even than the building around them. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a rattling breath came out. He seemed to be trying to find the words to break the decades of silence, but was failing to even find the air. The moment, so long dreaded, was here. Chapter 4. Flight from a Gilded Cage. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of years of separation, of a past that refused to stay buried. Donato Derossi, the man who had once commanded armies of men, the man who had built an empire on fear and respect, was now reduced to a frail, skeletal figure, struggling for every breath. Yet, even in his weakened state, there was a presence about him, an aura of power that clung to him like a shroud. Aurora stood frozen, her gaze locked with his. She felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her, anger, resentment, pity, and a flicker of something she couldn't quite identify, something that felt familiar. He opened his mouth again, his lips moving soundlessly. Then, with a visible effort, he managed to speak, his voice a raspy whisper that barely reached her across the room. "Aurora?" He croaked, the name a question, a plea, a fragile thread reaching across the chasm of time. The sound of her name, spoken by this man, her father, sent a shiver through her. It was a name she had heard countless times, but never like this, never with this weight of history, of consequence, attached to it. She took a step forward, then another, her legs moving mechanically, as if guided by an unseen force. She stopped a few feet from his chair, close enough to see the intricate network of wrinkles that crisscrossed his face, the faint tremor in his hands, the labored rise and fall of his chest. "Yes," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the turmoil within her.
"I'm Aurora."
He studied her for a long moment, his eyes, still sharp and piercing, taking in every detail of her appearance. He seemed to be searching for something, a resemblance, perhaps, to the woman he had loved, the woman who had fled from him all those years ago. You look like your mother, he said, his voice still weak, but filled with a hint of wonder, a trace of the man he had once been. Aurora felt a pang of emotion, a sudden, unexpected wave of grief for the mother she had lost, the mother who had carried this secret, this burden, for so many years. She died 5 years ago, Aurora said, the words a simple statement of fact, but laced with a lifetime of unspoken sorrow. Donato's eyes closed briefly, a flicker of pain crossing his face. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry. The apology, so simple, so inadequate, hung in the air. Aurora didn't know what to say. She had expected anger, defiance, perhaps even a confrontation. But this frail, dying man, offering a belated apology for a lifetime of absence, it disarmed her. Tommaso, who had remained silent by the door, now stepped forward. Don Donato, he said, his voice respectful but firm. You shouldn't tire yourself. Donato waved a dismissive hand, his gaze still fixed on Aurora. Leave us, he said, his voice surprisingly strong, a flicker of his former authority returning. I want to talk to my daughter. Tommaso hesitated, his eyes darting between Aurora and Donato. He was clearly concerned about his patron's health, but he also understood the importance of this moment, the need for a private reckoning between father and daughter. As you wish, Don Donato, he said, bowing his head slightly. He turned to Aurora, his gray eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was a warning in his gaze, a silent plea for caution, but also, perhaps, a hint of understanding. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Aurora and Donato were alone. The silence returned, but it was different now, less charged, less heavy. It was the silence of two people connected by blood, by a shared history, trying to bridge the gap that separated them. Sit, Donato said, gesturing towards a chair opposite his. Aurora hesitated, then sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt strangely vulnerable, exposed, sitting in this room, surrounded by the relics of her father's life, a life she had never known. Why? She asked, the word a direct challenge, a demand for answers. Why did you wait so long? Why didn't you try to find us? Donato sighed, a long, ragged sound. I did, he said, his voice barely a whisper. At first. I sent men to look for you, for your mother. But she was clever. She covered her tracks well. And then I was told that you were both dead. Aurora felt a chill run through her. Dead? She repeated, her voice incredulous. Who told you that? Donato's eyes flickered with a hint of fear. A rival family, he said, his voice hesitant. They wanted to hurt me. They knew that you were my weakness. A rival family. The words resonated with a chilling familiarity. Aurora remembered the shadowy men, the fleeting glimpses of danger, the constant sense of unease that had permeated her childhood. It all made sense now. And you believed them? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. Donato looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the hearth. I had no reason not to, he said, his voice filled with regret. I was consumed by grief, by rage. I lashed out. I made mistakes. Mistakes that cost me everything. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep, abiding sorrow that touched her despite herself. I never stopped thinking about you, he said, his voice trembling. Never stopped wondering what might have been. He reached out a trembling hand towards her, his fingers gnarled and twisted. Aurora hesitated, then, slowly reached out and took his hand. His skin was thin and papery, his grip surprisingly strong. A spark passed between them, a connection, a recognition. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps. The moment stretched, filled with a fragile hope, a tentative understanding. But just as Aurora began to feel a glimmer of peace, a sense of closure, Donato's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes widening with alarm. They know, he gasped, his voice strained, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They know you're alive, they're coming. His words were cut short by a sudden, sharp sound, like glass shattering. The doors to the study burst open, and two men rushed in, their faces masked, their hands holding guns. Aurora screamed, jumping to her feet. The fragile peace, the tentative connection, shattered in an instant. The world of violence, the world she had tried so hard to escape, had found her. And it was about to claim her, just as it had claimed her father. One of the men raised his gun, aiming it directly at her. Chapter 5. Tommaso's Shadowed Embrace. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity. Aurora stared down the barrel of the gun, her mind blank with terror. She saw the masked man's finger tighten on the trigger, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that would end her life. But before the shot could ring out, a figure moved with lightning speed. Tommaso. He had been outside the door, listening, anticipating. He lunged forward, knocking the gunman's arm aside just as the weapon discharged. The bullet went wild, shattering a nearby vase, sending shards of porcelain flying through the air. The room erupted in chaos. Donato cried out, his frail voice lost in the din. The second masked man turned towards Tommaso, raising his own gun. But Tommaso was faster. He disarmed the man with a swift, brutal movement, twisting his arm until the bones snapped with a sickening crack. The man screamed in pain, dropping the gun. Tommaso didn't hesitate. He grabbed the first gunman, who was struggling to regain his footing, and slammed him against the wall with bone-jarring force. The man slumped to the floor, unconscious. It all happened in a matter of seconds, a whirlwind of violence that left Aurora breathless and trembling. She stood frozen, her back against the wall, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Tommaso turned to her, his chest heaving, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, protective intensity. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough, urgent. Aurora nodded, unable to speak. She was shaking uncontrollably, her body reacting to the adrenaline coursing through her veins. He moved towards her, his hand reaching out to touch her, to reassure her. But then he stopped, his hand hovering just inches from her arm. He seemed to be struggling with something, an internal conflict that played across his features. The moment stretched, filled with an unspoken tension, a strange, electric current that crackled between them. The chaos of the past few seconds faded into the background, replaced by a heightened awareness of each other, of the danger that had brought them together, of the unspoken connection that bound them. Then, with a visible effort, he lowered his hand. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice still rough, but controlled.
"Now."
He turned towards Donato, who was slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn. Elena, the housekeeper, rushed into the room, her face etched with terror. "Don Donato, are you all right?" "He's alive," Tommaso said, his voice curt. "But we need to move him. Somewhere safe." He looked at Aurora, his gaze intense, questioning.
"Can you help me?"
She nodded, her mind still reeling, but her instincts taking over. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear. Together, they helped Donato out of his chair and into a wheelchair that Elena had brought. He was weak and disoriented, but conscious. Tommaso quickly assessed the situation. The villa was no longer safe. The attack had been too brazen, too well coordinated. They needed to disappear, to find a place where they wouldn't be found. "Elena," he said, his voice sharp, commanding.
"Get the car ready."
"The back entrance. We're leaving now." Elena nodded, her face pale but determined. She hurried out of the room. Tommaso turned to Aurora. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Don't leave my sight." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She trusted him. She had no choice. He was her only protection in this terrifying, unfamiliar world. They moved quickly, pushing Donato's wheelchair through the dimly lit hallways towards the back of the villa. The silence was broken only by the soft whir of the wheelchair's wheels and the ragged sound of Donato's breathing. They reached the back entrance, a small, unassuming door that led to a service courtyard. Elena was waiting for them, the engine of the Maserati running. Tommaso helped Donato into the back seat, then turned to Aurora. "Get in," he said, his voice urgent. She climbed into the car, settling into the plush leather seat next to her father. Tommaso got in behind the wheel, his movements quick and efficient. He slammed the car into gear and sped away from the villa, leaving behind the shattered remnants of her newfound family, the echoes of violence, the terrifying reality of her inheritance. As they drove, Aurora looked back at the villa, its dark silhouette receding into the distance. She felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, but also a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. She was escaping, fleeing from the danger, from the suffocating weight of her legacy. But she knew, deep down, that she couldn't escape forever. She was a Darasi, and the world she had tried so hard to avoid was now a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. She glanced at Tommaso, his profile stark and unyielding against the darkness. He was her protector, her guide, her something else, something she couldn't quite define. A connection had formed, forged in the crucible of danger, a bond that was both terrifying and alluring. The car raced through the darkness. Tommaso took one hand off the wheel and put it over hers. Chapter 6. Echoes of a Forbidden Past. The warmth of Tommaso's hand covering hers was a surprising comfort, a small anchor in the storm of uncertainty that raged around them. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a silent promise of protection, a reassurance that she wasn't alone in this terrifying new reality. She glanced at him, his profile illuminated by the fleeting glow of passing streetlights. His jaw was clenched, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but she could sense the tension in his body, the coiled energy of a predator ready to strike. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the road. "Somewhere safe," he said finally, his voice low and guarded. "Somewhere they won't find us."
They.
The word hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the danger that pursued them. Aurora didn't know who they were, but she knew that they were powerful, relentless, and determined to silence her, to eliminate the last vestige of Donato Darasi's legacy. She looked at Donato, slumped in the seat beside her, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. He looked so frail, so vulnerable, a stark contrast to the image of the ruthless mafia boss she had conjured in her mind. She felt a pang of guilt, a sudden, unexpected wave of sympathy for this man, her father. He had made terrible choices, lived a life of violence and deception, but he was still her father. And he was dying. "How is he?" she asked, turning back to Tommaso. Tommaso glanced at Donato in the rearview mirror. "He's weak," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "But he's alive. We need to get him to a doctor, someone we can trust." Someone we can trust. Another phrase that belonged to this shadowy underworld, a world where loyalty was a precious commodity and betrayal a constant threat. Aurora leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes, trying to make sense of the events of the past few hours. Her life had been turned upside down, shattered into a million pieces. She was no longer Amelia Russo, the quiet, unassuming art history professor. She was Aurora Darasi, the daughter of a mafia king, a target for his enemies, a pawn in a deadly game she didn't understand. And yet, amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of exhilaration. She had lived a sheltered life, a life of routine and predictability. Now, she was thrust into a world of danger and intrigue, a world where every moment was a risk, every decision a gamble. She opened her eyes, looking at Tommaso again. He was a part of this world, a key player in this deadly game. He was her protector, her guide, and something more. The connection between them, forged in the crucible of danger, was undeniable. It was a connection that defied logic and reason, a pull that was both terrifying and alluring. She remembered the way he had looked at her, the intensity in his gray eyes, the way his hand had hovered over hers, as if he had wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but had held back. There was something there, something unspoken, a hidden depth that she was desperate to explore. The car turned off the main road and onto a narrow, winding lane, surrounded by dense forest. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice hushed. "My family's estate," Tommaso replied, his voice low. "It's been abandoned for years.
No one knows about it.
We'll be safe here, at least for tonight." His family's estate. Another piece of the puzzle, another glimpse into his past, a past that was inextricably linked to hers. The car continued along the lane, finally reaching a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a crumbling, stone villa, its windows dark and empty, its walls covered in ivy. It looked like something out of a ghost story, a relic of a bygone era, a place where secrets were buried and forgotten. Tommaso stopped the car in front of the villa. He turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers. "We'll need to be careful," he said, his voice serious.
No lights, no noise.
"We don't want to attract any attention." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear was back, stronger than ever, but it was tempered by a newfound determination. She would survive this. She would protect her father. And she would unravel the mystery of her past, no matter the cost. She would learn more about this man, her protector, this enigma named Tommaso. He got out of the car and came around to open her door. She stepped out, her legs feeling unsteady. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of decay and damp earth. He led her towards the villa, his hand once again hovering just above her elbow, offering a silent reassurance, a subtle gesture of protection. As they reached the entrance, a massive wooden door, its surface weathered and cracked, Tommaso pulled out a large, iron key. He inserted the key into the lock, turning it with a loud, grating sound. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. He stepped inside, pulling her with him. The darkness enveloped them, complete and absolute. Aurora felt a surge of panic, a primal fear of the unknown. Then, Tommaso's arms slipped around her waist, pulling her close. His body was warm and solid, a reassuring presence in the darkness. She could feel his breath on her hair, smell the familiar scent of his cologne, mingled with the scent of the old house. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. "I'm here." His words, so simple, so reassuring, sent a wave of warmth through her. She leaned into him, her body trembling, her fear momentarily forgotten. She felt safe, protected, in his embrace. A feeling she hadn't realized she had been craving. She craved this protection, this connection. The darkness was no longer terrifying. It was comforting. A refuge from the storm, a place where she could let down her guard, where she could be vulnerable, where she could be herself. Even if she still did not know what that self was meant to be now. He held her for a long moment, his body a shield against the darkness, against the unknown. And in that moment, Aurora knew that she was no longer just fleeing from danger. She was running towards something she couldn't quite define, something that was both terrifying and irresistible. She was running towards Tommaso. The sound of his heartbeat, so close to her ear, echoed in the darkness, a strong pulse that seemed to hold them together. Chapter 7. The Weight of Unspoken Promises. The darkness within the abandoned villa was profound, a thick, velvety blanket that muffled sound and obscured vision. But within that darkness, Aurora felt a strange sense of security, a feeling of being cocooned, protected by Tommaso's presence. His arm remained firmly around her waist, his body a solid, reassuring warmth against hers. He moved slowly, cautiously, navigating the unfamiliar space with a practiced ease that suggested he knew the layout of the villa intimately, despite its years of abandonment. She stumbled once, her foot catching on a loose floorboard, and he tightened his grip, steadying her. "Careful," he murmured, his voice a low rumble close to her ear. She could feel his breath on her skin, a warm, intimate sensation that sent a shiver through her. It was a shiver not of fear, but of something else, something she couldn't quite name, a heightened awareness of his proximity, of the subtle strength of his body, of the unspoken connection that bound them. He found a light switch, flicking it on. Nothing happened. No power, he said, his voice matter-of-fact. We'll have to use candles. He retrieved a small, silver lighter from his pocket, the flame illuminating his face for a fleeting moment. His features, usually so hard and unyielding, seemed softer in the flickering light, his gray eyes holding a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. He found a candelabra on a nearby table, its silver tarnished with age, its candles long melted down to stubs. He lit the few remaining inches, the flames casting a warm, dancing glow that pushed back the darkness, revealing a large, dusty room, filled with shrouded furniture and cobweb-draped chandeliers. It was a grand room, once elegant and opulent, now a relic of a bygone era. The air was thick with a scent of dust and decay, a smell that evoked a sense of history, of forgotten lives, of a past that clung to the very walls of the villa. "This was your family's home?" Aurora asked, her voice hushed, breaking the silence. Tommaso nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room, a flicker of something that might have been nostalgia, or perhaps regret, crossing his features. "My grandfather built it," he said, his voice low. "He was a powerful man."
In his own way.
In his own way. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Aurora knew, without being told, that Tommaso's grandfather, like her own father, had been a part of the Mafia, a man who had lived by a different code, a man who had wielded power and influence in the shadows. "And your parents?" she asked, curious to learn more about his past, about the forces that had shaped him into the man he was. His expression shifted, a shadow crossing his face. "They died when I was young," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion.
"A car accident."
Aurora sensed that there was more to the story, a hidden truth that he wasn't willing to share. She didn't press him, knowing that some wounds were too deep, too personal to be exposed. He moved towards a large, stone fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. "We'll need a fire," he said, his voice practical, breaking the silence. "It gets cold at night." He found some wood in a nearby basket, dry and brittle with age. He arranged the wood in the hearth, then used his lighter to ignite it. The flames caught quickly, spreading a warm, flickering glow throughout the room. Aurora watched him, admiring his efficiency, his competence, his ability to take charge, to create a sense of order and security in the midst of chaos. He was a man of action, a man who knew how to survive, a man who was accustomed to danger. And yet, there was also a gentleness about him, a vulnerability that he kept carefully hidden, a depth of emotion that she glimpsed only in fleeting moments, in the subtle softening of his features, in the warmth of his touch, in the unspoken promises that hung between them. He finished building the fire, then turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "There's probably some food in the pantry if we're lucky." Aurora realized that she was, in fact, ravenous. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the adrenaline of the past few hours had drained her energy. "Yes," she said, nodding. "I am." He led her through the villa, navigating the darkened hallways with a familiarity that surprised her. He found a small, dusty pantry, its shelves lined with jars and cans, most of them long past their expiration dates. He managed to find some canned soup, some crackers, and a bottle of wine, its label faded and torn. It was a meager meal, but it was enough. They returned to the main room, settling down on the floor in front of the fire. Tommaso opened the soup and poured it into two chipped porcelain bowls he had found. He opened the wine, using a corkscrew he had retrieved from a drawer. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of their spoons against the bowls. The soup was warm and comforting, the crackers stale but satisfying, the wine surprisingly good, despite its age. As they ate, Aurora studied Tommaso, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He was a handsome man, undeniably so, with his strong jawline, his high cheekbones, his intense gray eyes. But it was more than just his physical appearance that attracted her. It was his strength, his confidence, his unwavering loyalty, his hidden vulnerability. It was the way he made her feel, safe and protected, even in the midst of danger. He caught her looking at him, raising a dark eyebrow in a silent question. She blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. She looked away, embarrassed by her own boldness. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For everything." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice low. "I told you, I owe your father a debt." The statement was a reminder that he wasn't doing it for her, just for Donato. But the subtle intimacy between them was growing. "But you risked your life for me," she said, looking back at him, her eyes meeting his. "Back at the villa. You could have been killed." His lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's what I do," he said simply. "I protect those who need protecting." He paused and held her eyes. "Especially you." The fire, almost catching up to the candelabra, flickered between them. Chapter 8. A dance of danger and desire. That single word, especially, hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken meaning. It was a subtle shift, a delicate acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing between them, a connection that went beyond loyalty, beyond duty, beyond the debt he owed her father. Aurora felt her heart beat faster, a flutter of anticipation, of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden desire, a spark of attraction in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. She looked at him, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, his gray eyes holding a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of intensity, of protectiveness, and something else. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin. It was a tentative gesture, a hesitant exploration, as if he were testing the boundaries, unsure of how she would react. She didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her eyes holding a question, an invitation, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken attraction that shimmered between them. He traced the outline of her hand, his touch gentle, deliberate, sending a shiver of pleasure through her. It was a simple touch, but it was loaded with meaning, with unspoken promises, with a shared understanding of the danger that surrounded them and the fragile bond that had formed between them. "Aurora," he murmured, her name a soft caress on his lips. It was the first time he had spoken her name without the formal Darasi attached to it. It was a subtle shift, but it felt significant, a sign of intimacy, of a growing closeness. She leaned towards him, drawn by an invisible force, her body responding to his presence, to his touch, to the unspoken desire that crackled between them. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. His eyes searched hers, his gaze intense, questioning, seeking permission, reassurance. She closed her eyes, giving herself over to the moment, to the overwhelming sensation of his touch, of his nearness, of the forbidden desire that had been simmering beneath the surface. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant kiss, a soft exploration of uncharted territory. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of vulnerability, of a shared need for connection, for comfort, for something real in a world of shadows and deception. Aurora responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of pent-up emotions, of fear and desire, of a lifetime of loneliness and a newfound hope. The fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy around them. The outside world, with its dangers and uncertainties, faded away, replaced by the overwhelming presence of each other, of the undeniable connection that bound them. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in unison. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotion, with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. "Tommaso," she whispered, her voice trembling, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of the moment with the lifetime of caution and restraint that had defined her. He touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. "I know," he said, his voice rough, husky with emotion. "It's complicated. Complicated." It was an understatement. Their lives were intertwined in a web of loyalty and betrayal, of family secrets and hidden dangers. They were from different worlds, separated by age, by experience, by the weight of their respective legacies. And yet, despite all the obstacles, despite all the reasons why it shouldn't be, the attraction between them was undeniable. It was a force of nature, a pull that defied logic and reason, a spark that had ignited in the darkness and now threatened to consume them. What would happen now? She asked, her voice hesitant, unsure of what the future held, of what this moment meant for them. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of desire and something else. Something that looked like fear. I don't know, he admitted, his voice honest, vulnerable. But I know this, I won't let anything happen to you. I promise you that. His words, so simple, so sincere, sent a wave of warmth through her. She trusted him. She knew, deep down, that he would protect her, even if it meant risking his own life. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his body a shield against the darkness, against the unknown. They stayed like that for a long time, silent, content, lost in the moment, in the shared warmth of their embrace, in the fragile hope that had blossomed between them. The fire gradually died down, the embers glowing red in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The outside world, with its dangers and uncertainties, seemed far away, irrelevant. But Aurora knew that the peace was temporary, that the storm was still raging, that they would soon have to face the reality of their situation. She also knew that this moment, this stolen moment of intimacy, of connection, would stay with her forever, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, love, or something like it, could still bloom. The first rays of dawn would, undoubtedly, reveal the harsh truths they had, for now, managed to evade. The silence was broken by the harsh ring of Tommaso's phone. He pulled away, a flicker of annoyance on his face, before he checked the caller ID. His entire demeanor changed. Chapter 9. The Cracks in the Family Crest. The jarring ring of Tommaso's phone shattered the fragile peace, ripping them back to the harsh reality they had momentarily escaped. Aurora watched as his expression shifted, the fleeting tenderness replaced by a mask of cold control. He checked the caller ID, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenching. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice hushed, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the phone screen. "It's someone I trust," he said finally, his voice guarded, revealing nothing. "Someone who can help us." He answered the call, his voice low and urgent, speaking in rapid Italian. Aurora couldn't understand everything he was saying, but she caught snippets of words, phrases that sent a shiver of fear down her spine. Tradimento, emboscada, pericolo, betrayal, ambush, danger. The conversation was brief, intense. Tommaso listened more than he spoke, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he finally hung up, he turned to Aurora, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's happened?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, as if weighing how much to tell her. "There's been a development," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The attack on your father, it wasn't random. It wasn't a rival family." Aurora felt a chill run through her. "Then who?" He took a deep breath, his gaze holding hers. "It was someone inside. Someone within the Derossi family." The words hit her like a physical blow. Betrayal. From within. The very people who were supposed to be her family, her protectors, were the ones who wanted her dead. "But who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
"Why?"
Tommaso shook his head. "I don't know all the details yet," he said. "But it seems there's a power struggle within the family. Your father's illness, it's created a vacuum. Someone wants to take control. And they see you as a threat. A threat." The word resonated with a chilling familiarity. She was a threat, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Because of her blood, her lineage, her legacy. "Who is it on the call?" Aurora suddenly needed to know. "My cousin, Marco." He is loyal and informed. He will meet us, so what do we do? She asked, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of this new, terrifying reality. Tommaso's expression hardened, his eyes taking on a steely glint. We fight back, he said, his voice low and determined. We expose the traitor. We protect your father. And we reclaim what is rightfully yours.
We. He had said we.
He was including her in this fight, this struggle for power, this deadly game of family politics. He was offering her a partnership, a shared destiny. But at that moment, she couldn't find it in herself to accept his shared purpose. She wasn't a fighter. She was an academic, a scholar, a woman who had lived a quiet, peaceful life. She wasn't prepared for this world of violence and deception, of betrayal and revenge. She hesitated and looked into his eyes. I don't know anything about this world. How can I possibly? He saw her face, and his eyes slightly softened. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. You're stronger than you think, Aurora, he said, his voice soft, reassuring. You have the blood of a Darasi. You have courage. You have resilience. And you have me. His words, his touch, his unwavering belief in her, gave her a flicker of hope, a spark of courage. She wasn't alone. She had him. And perhaps, together, they could survive this. But we need to be careful, he continued, his voice serious. We can't trust anyone, not even within the family. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her. We need a plan, he said. We need to figure out who we can trust, who our enemies are, and how to strike back. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind clearly racing, formulating a strategy. He was a warrior, a strategist, a man accustomed to fighting battles, to navigating treacherous landscapes. Aurora watched him, admiring his strength, his confidence, his unwavering determination. She was drawn to him, to his power, to his protective instincts. But she was also afraid. Afraid of the world she had been thrust into, afraid of the danger that surrounded them, afraid of the growing feelings she had for this man, this enigmatic protector who had become her only ally. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. We leave at first light, he said, his voice decisive. We'll go to Marco. He'll help us. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. Are you with me? He asked, the question a challenge, an invitation a plea. Aurora took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, yes. But she was also determined. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would face this, whatever it might bring. She met his gaze, her eyes holding a newfound strength, a flicker of the Darasi fire that burned within her. Yes, she said, her voice firm, resolute. I'm with you. The words were a commitment, a vow, a declaration of war. She had chosen her side. She had chosen him, and she would fight alongside him, for her father, for her legacy, and for something more. Something that was still undefined, something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Something that was love. The unspoken pact felt heavier than the ancient stones of the villa around them. Chapter 10. Revelations in the Lion's Denver. The journey to Marco's was tense, filled with a suffocating silence that spoke volumes about the danger they were in. Tommaso drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the road, the mirrors, the surrounding landscape, alert for any sign of pursuit, any hint of betrayal. Aurora sat beside him, her body rigid with tension, her mind racing, trying to process the information she had learned, the implications of the internal power struggle within the Darasi family. She was an outsider, thrust into a world of intricate alliances and deadly rivalries, a world she didn't understand, a world where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She glanced at Tommaso, his profile stark and unyielding against the backdrop of the early morning light. He was her protector, her guide, her lover. The words still felt strange, unfamiliar, a forbidden fruit she had tasted, a dangerous desire she couldn't deny. The memory of their kiss, of his touch, of the shared intimacy they had found in the darkness of the abandoned villa, sent a shiver of warmth through her, a fleeting moment of comfort in the midst of the storm. But the warmth was quickly replaced by a cold wave of fear. She was falling for him, for this dangerous, enigmatic man who lived by a different code, a man who was both her protector and a potential threat. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between desire and danger, between trust and suspicion. They arrived at Marco's estate, a modern, sprawling villa perched on a hilltop overlooking the city. It was a stark contrast to the crumbling, ancient villa they had left behind, a symbol of the new generation of the Mafia, of a world that had adapted and evolved, but still clung to its roots of power and violence. The villa was surrounded by high walls, topped with razor wire and surveillance cameras. Guards, armed and alert, patrolled the perimeter, their eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, but also a potential trap. Tommaso stopped the car in front of a pair of massive, steel gates. He spoke into an intercom, his voice low and guarded. After a brief exchange, the gates swung open, revealing a long, winding driveway that led to the main house. They drove through the gates, entering a world of manicured lawns, sculpted gardens, and shimmering fountains. It was a display of wealth and power, a blatant demonstration of the resources at Marco's disposal. They parked the car in front of the main entrance, a towering glass and steel structure that exuded modern elegance and cold efficiency. A man was waiting for them, standing at the top of the steps, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It was Marco. Aurora recognized him from Tommaso's description, tall, lean, with sharp features and intense, dark eyes. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his demeanor radiating confidence and control. He looked like a businessman, a CEO, not a mafia underboss. But Aurora knew that beneath the polished exterior, there was a core of steel, a ruthlessness that made him a formidable ally or a deadly enemy. Tommaso got out of the car and approached Marco, embracing him in a traditional Italian greeting, a hug and a kiss on both cheeks. They spoke in rapid Italian, their voices low and urgent. Aurora got out of the car, feeling awkward and out of place. She was an outsider, a stranger in this world of power and privilege, of hidden agendas and unspoken threats. Tommaso turned to her, introducing her to Marco. Marco, this is Aurora Derossi. Aurora, this is my cousin Marco Vitali. Marco's gaze swept over her, assessing, evaluating. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see right through her, stripping away her carefully constructed facade. Signora Derossi, he said, his voice smooth, polite, but with an underlying edge of steel. Welcome to my home. He extended his hand, and Aurora shook it, his grip firm and strong. She felt a shiver of apprehension, a sense of unease. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. They went inside, entering a vast, open-plan living area, filled with designer furniture, modern art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city below. It was a stunning space, designed to impress, to intimidate, to showcase power and wealth. Marco led them to a seating area, gesturing for them to sit down. He poured them drinks, offering Aurora a glass of chilled Prosecco. She took it, her hand trembling slightly. Tommaso tells me you've had a difficult time, Marco said, his gaze fixed on Aurora. Difficult is an understatement, Aurora replied, her voice dry, laced with a hint of bitterness. Marco nodded, his expression unchanged. I understand, he said. The Derossi family, it's not always a safe place to be. He paused, taking a sip of his drink. Tommaso tells me you believe there's a traitor within the family, he continued, his gaze shifting to Tommaso. Someone who wants to eliminate Aurora and take control. Tommaso nodded, his expression grim. That's right, he said. The attack on Don Donato, it was an inside job. Marco leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed, his mind clearly working, analyzing the situation. And you have no idea who it is? He asked. Tommaso shook his head. Not yet, he said. But we're working on it. Marco was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the city below. Then he turned back to them, his expression serious. I have some information, he said, his voice low. Information that might help you. He paused, taking a deep breath. There are rumors, he continued. Rumors of a secret alliance between a faction within the Derossi family and the Rizzos. The Rizzos. The name sent a chill down Aurora's spine. They were the Derossi family's oldest and most bitter rivals, a constant threat, a source of endless conflict and bloodshed. The Rizzos? Tommaso said, his voice incredulous. That's impossible. There's a blood feud between our families. It goes back generations.
Marco nodded.
I know, he said. But these are just rumors. I haven't been able to confirm anything. He paused, his gaze shifting to Aurora. But if it's true, he continued, his voice grave. If there is an alliance, it changes everything. It means that the threat is even greater than you imagined. Aurora felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. An alliance between the Derossis and the Rizzos. It was unthinkable. It was a nightmare scenario. Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who within the Derossi family would betray us like this? Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked like suspicion. I don't know, he said. But I have my suspicions. And I think it's someone close to your father. Someone he trusts. He paused, his gaze lingering on Aurora. Someone like his consigliere, Marco said slowly. Like Salvatore Rossi.
Salvatore Rossi.
Don Donato's most trusted advisor, his right-hand man, the man who had been with him for decades. The man who was almost family. Aurora couldn't believe it. Salvatore had always seemed so loyal, so devoted to Donato. It was impossible, wasn't it? Marco watched the blood drain from her face. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty and Love. The name hung in the air, a poisoned dart, striking at the heart of Aurora's already fractured world.
Salvatore Rossi.
The consigliere, Don Donato's most trusted advisor, the man who had been a fixture in her father's life, a shadow of loyalty and support. The idea that he could be a traitor, that he could be plotting against them, against her, it was almost impossible to comprehend. Aurora shook her head, her mind reeling. No, she said, her voice a choked whisper. It can't be. Salvatore, he's like family. He would never. Marco's expression remained impassive, his dark eyes holding a mixture of pity and cold calculation. Family can be the deadliest of enemies, Signora de Rossi, he said, his voice smooth, but laced with a chilling cynicism. Especially in our world. Tommaso, who had been silent, listening intently, now spoke, his voice low and troubled. Salvatore, he's always been fiercely loyal to Don Donato, he said, his gaze shifting to Marco. I've known him for years. I can't believe he would betray him. Marco shrugged, a subtle gesture that conveyed a world of unspoken doubts and suspicions. Loyalty is a fluid thing, Tommaso, he said. It can be bought, it can be broken, it can be twisted to serve one's own ambitions. He paused, his gaze fixed on Aurora. Your father's illness, it's changed everything, he continued. It's created a power vacuum. People are scrambling for position, for control. Old loyalties are being tested. New alliances are being formed. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I've heard whispers, rumors that Salvatore has been meeting with representatives of the Rizzo family, he said. Secret meetings in neutral territory. They're planning something, I'm sure of it. Aurora felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The evidence, however circumstantial, was mounting. Salvatore's proximity to her father, his influence within the family, his access to information, it all made him a prime suspect.
But why?
She asked, her voice trembling. Why would he do this? What does he have to gain? Marco's lips curved into a thin, cynical smile. The power, Signora de Rossi, he said. The ultimate prize. With your father out of the picture, Salvatore would be in a position to take control of the de Rossi empire. And with the support of the Rizzos, he would be unstoppable. The thought was horrifying. A man she had considered almost an uncle, a man who had been a part of her father's life for decades, plotting to usurp his power, to betray his trust, to kill his daughter. We need proof, Tommaso said, his voice firm, his eyes narrowed in determination. We can't accuse Salvatore without concrete evidence. It would tear the family apart.
Marco Nari. Agreed, he said.
But we need to be careful. Salvatore is a dangerous man. He has eyes and ears everywhere. We can't let him know we're suspicious. He paused, his gaze shifting to Aurora. You, Signora de Rossi, he continued. You are the key. You are the one who can get close to him. You are the one he won't suspect. Aurora felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct for self-preservation. She was being asked to play a dangerous game, to walk into the lion's den, to confront a man who might be her enemy, a man who might be plotting her death. I don't know, she said, her voice hesitant, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she was being asked to do. I'm not a spy. I'm not a mafia princess. I'm just Aurora de Rossi. Tommaso interrupted, his voice firm, his gray eyes holding hers. And you are stronger than you think. You have the courage to do what needs to be done. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her, a spark of reassurance in the midst of the storm. We'll be with you, he said, his voice low and reassuring. We'll protect you. We won't let anything happen to you. His words, his touch, his unwavering belief in her, gave her a flicker of hope, a surge of determination. She wasn't alone. She had him. And she had Marco, however much she might distrust him. She looked at Marco, his dark eyes watching her, waiting for her answer. She knew what she had to do. She had to face this, for her father, for her legacy, and for Tommaso. All right, she said, her voice firm, resolute. I'll do it. I'll get close to Salvatore. I'll find out the truth. The words were a commitment, a vow, a dangerous gamble. She had stepped into the game, a pawn in a deadly struggle for power, a player in a world she didn't understand, a world where loyalty was a fleeting illusion and betrayal a constant threat. Marco nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Good, he said. We need to move quickly. Time is of the essence. He outlined a plan, a dangerous and intricate scheme to expose Salvatore, to gather evidence of his treachery, to prevent him from seizing control of the de Rossi family. The plan involved Aurora returning to her father's villa, pretending to be the grieving, naive daughter, unaware of the danger that surrounded her. She would use her proximity to Salvatore, her access to information, to gather evidence, to uncover his secrets. It was a risky plan, a gamble with her life, a dance with the devil. But she had no choice. She had to do this. For her father, for her legacy, and for the man who stood beside her, the man who had become her protector, her lover, her only hope in this treacherous world. Tommaso stood. We must prepare. It is almost dusk. The words cast a long shadow over the three, the plan itself precarious. Chapter 12. Scars of the past, bonds of the present. The preparation for Aurora's return to the de Rossi villa was a tense, hushed affair. Every detail was meticulously planned, every contingency considered. Marco provided her with a small, discreet recording device, disguised as a pen, to capture any incriminating conversations with Salvatore. Tommaso insisted on equipping her with a miniature GPS tracker hidden in the lining of her handbag so they could monitor her movements and ensure her safety. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken anxieties, with the weight of the dangerous task that lay ahead. Aurora felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach, a primal dread of facing Salvatore, of playing the role of the unsuspecting daughter, of walking into a potential trap. Tommaso, sensing her fear, drew her aside, leading her to a quiet corner of Marco's opulent living room. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like tenderness, like love. Are you sure about this, Aurora? He asked, his voice low and gentle. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. She shook her head, her resolve hardening.
No, she said, her voice firm.
I have to do this.
For my father.
For us. The word us hung in the air between them, a fragile acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, of the unspoken love that had blossomed in the midst of danger and uncertainty. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. You're brave, Aurora, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Brave and strong. I admire you. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the moment of intimacy, of connection, a fleeting respite from the fear that threatened to consume her. I'm scared, Tommaso, she admitted, her voice a whisper.
I'm terrified.
He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, his body a shield against the world, against the unknown. I know, he said, his voice close to her ear. But you're not alone. I'm here. I'll always be here. His words, his embrace, his unwavering presence gave her a surge of strength, a renewed sense of determination. She could do this. She had to. They stood like that for a long moment, silent, connected, their hearts beating in unison, their bodies intertwined, drawing strength and comfort from each other. Then, reluctantly, he released her. We need to go, he said, his voice regretful. It's almost time. He led her back to where Marco was waiting, his expression grim and focused. Marco gave Aurora a final briefing, reminding her of the key points of the plan, of the importance of maintaining her cover, of the danger she was facing. Remember, Marco said, his voice serious. Trust no one. Except Tommaso. He's the only one you can rely on. Aurora nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was ready as she could ever be. Tommaso drove her back to the Derossi villa, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken tension. As they approached the villa, Aurora felt a wave of dread wash over her. It was no longer a place of refuge, a symbol of her family's legacy. It was a potential trap, a battleground, a place where danger lurked around every corner. Tommaso stopped the car a short distance from the villa, turning to face her. I'll be close, he said, his voice reassuring. I'll be watching. If anything goes wrong, I'll be there. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. Be careful, Aurora, he said, his voice filled with concern. Be very careful. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at him, her eyes conveying a mixture of fear and love. It was a love born of danger, of shared adversity, of a connection that defied logic and reason. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a brief, tender kiss, a silent promise of protection, of unwavering support. Then, she got out of the car, her legs feeling shaky and unsteady. She walked towards the villa, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, replaying the plan, preparing herself for the role she had to play. As she reached the entrance, the massive wooden door swung open, revealing Salvatore Rossi, standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and something else. Something that Aurora couldn't quite decipher. Something that made her skin crawl. Aurora, he said, his voice smooth, solicitous. You're back. I was so worried. Where have you been? She forced a smile, trying to appear calm and composed, despite the turmoil within her. I needed some time to think, she said, her voice trembling slightly. To process everything. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. Of course, Cara, he said, his voice filled with false sympathy.
It must be so difficult for you.
But you're safe now. You're home. His words, his touch, his feigned concern, sent a shiver of revulsion through her. She had to be strong. She had to play the part. She had to expose this man, this traitor, this enemy of her family. She drew on her memories, her father, her mother, and the burning fire of Tommaso waiting for her return. Chapter 13. A treacherous haven unveiled. Stepping back into the Derossi villa felt like entering a carefully constructed stage set. Everything was familiar, yet profoundly altered. The scent of old wood and beeswax, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the hallway, the hushed whispers of the staff, it was all as she remembered, yet tainted by the knowledge of the treachery that lurked beneath the surface. Salvatore hovered close, his presence a suffocating blend of feigned concern and veiled menace. He guided her through the familiar rooms, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture that once would have seemed comforting, now felt like a brand on her skin. Your father is resting, Kara, he said, his voice a smooth, practiced murmur. The doctors say he's stable but weak. He's been asking for you. Aurora nodded, her heart aching with a complex mix of grief and fear. She longed to see her father, to comfort him, to tell him what? That his most trusted advisor was plotting against him? That his legacy was on the brink of collapse? I'll go to him in a moment, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I need a moment to collect myself. Salvatore led her to her old room, a spacious, elegantly furnished chamber that had remained untouched since her childhood. It was a time capsule filled with relics of her past, a faded tapestry on the wall, a collection of antique dolls on a shelf, a worn copy of The Little Prince on her bedside table. It was a room that should have felt safe, comforting, a refuge from the storm. But now, it felt like a prison, a gilded cage where she was trapped, surrounded by enemies. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She needed to be strong. She needed to play the part. She needed to find proof of Salvatore's treachery, to expose him before it was too late. She activated the recording device, slipping the pen into the pocket of her dress. It was a small, almost insignificant act, but it felt momentous, a symbol of her defiance, of her determination to fight back. She spent the next few hours moving through the villa like a ghost, observing, listening, gathering fragments of information, piecing together the puzzle of Salvatore's betrayal. She overheard snippets of conversations between Salvatore and other members of the household staff, hushed whispers that spoke of arrangements and agreements and the Rizzos. She noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his eyes darted around, the way he seemed to be constantly on edge, as if expecting something or someone. She visited her father, sitting by his bedside, holding his frail hand, her heart breaking at the sight of his weakened state. He was barely conscious, his eyes flickering open occasionally, his lips moving soundlessly. She wanted to tell him everything, to warn him, to protect him. But she couldn't. She had to be patient. She had to gather evidence. As evening approached, Salvatore approached her, his expression solicitous. Aurora, Kara, he said, I've arranged a small dinner. Just the two of us. We need to talk about the future. The invitation, so seemingly innocent, sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. It was a trap, she was sure of it. But she couldn't refuse. She had to play along. Of course, Salvatore, she said, forcing a smile. That sounds lovely. The dinner was served in a small, intimate dining room, a table set with fine china, crystal glasses, and flickering candles. The atmosphere was strained, heavy with unspoken tension. Salvatore played the part of the concerned guardian, the loyal advisor, offering her words of comfort and reassurance, promising to protect her, to guide her through this difficult time. But Aurora saw through the facade. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the subtle cruelty in his smile, the barely concealed threat that lurked beneath his smooth words. As they ate, she steered the conversation towards the topic of the family, of the future, of the challenges they faced. She subtly probed, asking questions, seeking information, trying to draw him out, to get him to reveal his true intentions. The family, it's so fractured, she said, her voice laced with feigned sadness. I don't know who to trust anymore. Salvatore reached across the table, his hand covering hers. You can trust me, Aurora, he said, his voice smooth, reassuring. I will always be here for you. I will protect you, just as I protected your father. His words, his touch, sent a wave of revulsion through her. She wanted to pull away, to scream, to expose him for the traitor he was. But she held her composure. She maintained her facade. She continued to play the part. But the Rizzos, she said, her voice hesitant. They're a constant threat. I'm afraid of what they might do. Salvatore's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been guilt. Or perhaps just annoyance. The Rizzos are no longer a threat, Aurora, he said, his voice dismissive. I've taken care of that. Taken care of that. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Aurora felt a chill run through her. He had admitted it. He had confirmed his alliance with the Rizzos, his betrayal of her father, his plan to seize control. She needed to get out of there. She needed to get the recording to Tommaso, to expose Salvatore before it was too late. But just as she was about to make her move, the door to the dining room burst open, and two men rushed in, their faces masked, their hands holding guns. Aurora screamed, jumping to her feet. The carefully constructed facade shattered in an instant. The trap had been sprung, and she was caught right in the middle of it. Salvatore stood too, an expression of complete surprise on his face. Or was it? Chapter 14. The unraveling of deceitful threads. The sudden intrusion shattered the tense tableau, sending a jolt of pure terror through Aurora. Her carefully constructed composure evaporated, replaced by a primal fear for her life. The masked men, their eyes cold and menacing, moved with a practiced efficiency, their guns trained on her and Salvatore. But something was wrong. Salvatore's expression, initially one of shock and surprise, quickly morphed into something else. Something calculating. A flicker of satisfaction, perhaps? A hint of triumph? He didn't move to protect her. He didn't even seem particularly concerned for his own safety. He stood there, calmly observing the scene, as if he were a spectator, not a participant. What's going on? Aurora cried, her voice trembling, her eyes darting between the masked men and Salvatore. Salvatore, do something. Salvatore didn't respond. He simply stood there, a faint smile playing on his lips, a smile that sent a chill down Aurora's spine. One of the masked men stepped forward, his gun pointed directly at Aurora. Don't move, he growled, his voice muffled by the mask. Aurora froze, her body rigid with fear. She looked at Salvatore, pleadingly, desperately hoping for some sign of intervention, some indication that this was all a misunderstanding, that he wasn't the monster she believed him to be. But his expression remained unchanged. Cold, detached, almost amused. Then he spoke, his voice calm, controlled, devoid of any emotion. It's all right, Aurora, he said, his voice smooth, reassuring, the same voice he had used to comfort her, to deceive her. They're with me. The words hit her like a physical blow. They're with me. The confirmation, so blatant, so casual, sent a wave of nausea through her. He had betrayed her. He had betrayed her father. He had betrayed the entire family. You planned this? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to comprehend the depth of his treachery. Salvatore nodded, his smile widening, a chilling display of arrogance and cruelty. Of course, he said. Did you really think you could fool me, Kara? Did you really think I wouldn't see through your pathetic little charade? He stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of contempt and something else. Something that looked like pity? You're just like your mother, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Weak. Naive. Easily manipulated. The mention of her mother, the insult, the blatant disregard for her feelings, ignited a spark of anger within Aurora, a flicker of defiance that pushed back the fear. You're a monster, she said, her voice trembling, but filled with a newfound strength. You betrayed my father. You betrayed your family. You'll pay for this. Salvatore laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room. Pay for what, Kara? He said. For taking what is rightfully mine? For restoring the de Rossi family to its former glory? He gestured towards the masked men. These are my men, he said. Loyal to me, not to your weak, dying father. They will help me build a new empire, a stronger empire. An empire that will rule this city. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her. And you, Aurora, you were just a pawn in my game, he continued. A means to an end. A way to flush out the rats, to expose the weak links in the chain. He stepped even closer, his face inches from hers, his breath warm on her skin. But now you're of no further use to me, he said, his voice a low, menacing whisper. He nodded to the masked men. Take her, he said, and get rid of her. The men moved towards her, their guns trained on her, their intentions clear. Aurora felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to fight back, to escape. But before she could react, before the men could reach her, a figure burst through the doorway, a whirlwind of motion and fury. Tommaso. He moved with lightning speed, disarming one of the masked men, knocking him to the ground with a swift, brutal blow. He grabbed the other man, twisting his arm, forcing him to drop his gun. The room erupted in chaos, a struggle between Tommaso and the two masked men. Aurora watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind a blur of fear and hope. Tommaso was fighting for her, risking his life for her, just as he had promised. He was her protector, her savior, her love. The fight was brief, brutal, and decisive. Tommaso, with his years of experience, his training, his sheer force of will, quickly overpowered the two men, leaving them unconscious on the floor. He turned to Aurora, his chest heaving, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, protective intensity. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough, urgent. She nodded, unable to speak, her body trembling with relief and something else. Something deeper, something more profound. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I told you I'd be there," he said, his voice soft, reassuring. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the moment of safety, of connection, of love. Then, she looked at Salvatore, who was standing there, stunned, his carefully constructed plan unraveling before his eyes. "It's over, Salvatore," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "You're finished." Salvatore's expression shifted, his arrogance crumbling, replaced by a flicker of fear. He looked at Tommaso, his eyes filled with hatred and resentment. You ruined everything," he spat. Tommaso didn't respond. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on Salvatore, his body a shield between him and Aurora. "This isn't over," Salvatore snarled. "It will never be over." His eyes were those of a cornered animal. Chapter 15. Crossroads of Fate and Choice. Salvatore's defiant words hung in the air, a chilling reminder that the battle was far from over. Even cornered, stripped of his power, he remained a threat, a venomous serpent coiled and ready to strike. Tommaso, his gaze fixed on Salvatore, moved with a deliberate calm, his body a taut spring of controlled energy. He retrieved the discarded weapons, securing them, ensuring that Salvatore and his men were no longer a physical threat. "It's over for you, Salvatore," Tommaso said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Your betrayal has been exposed. Your ambitions crushed." Salvatore's face contorted in a mask of rage and frustration. He lunged at Tommaso, a desperate, futile attempt to regain control, to lash out at the man who had thwarted his plans. Tommaso easily sidestepped the attack, his movements fluid and graceful, a predator toying with its prey. He could have easily subdued Salvatore, incapacitated him, but he held back. "Don't make this worse than it already is, Salvatore," Tommaso said, his voice warning. "Surrender. It's your only option." Salvatore, panting, his chest heaving, glared at Tommaso with a mixture of hatred and fear. He knew he was defeated. His carefully constructed plan had crumbled, his dreams of power reduced to ashes. He looked at Aurora, his eyes filled with a venomous spite. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You think this changes anything? The Derossi family is doomed. It's rotten to the core. And you're just a pawn, a puppet, dancing to someone else's tune." His words, laced with bitterness and resentment, struck a chord within Aurora. She had been a pawn, yes, manipulated by Salvatore, used as bait in his deadly game. But she was no longer a puppet. She had chosen her side. She had chosen to fight. "I'm not afraid of you, Salvatore," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "And I'm not afraid of the Derossi family. I'll find my own way. I'll make my own choices." Her words, spoken with a newfound conviction, seemed to surprise Salvatore. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a pawn, but as a force to be reckoned with. Then, he looked at Tommaso, his gaze lingering on the two of them, a flicker of understanding, of envy, crossing his features. "You're a fool, Tommaso," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You're throwing your life away for her." For a woman who doesn't even belong here. Tommaso's expression didn't change. He simply stood there, his arm protectively around Aurora, his body a shield between her and Salvatore's venomous words. "She belongs with me," Tommaso said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. His words, so simple, so profound, sent a wave of warmth through Aurora. It was a declaration of love, of loyalty, of a commitment that transcended the boundaries of family, of duty, of the dangerous world they inhabited. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tense silence. Marco had alerted the authorities, his contacts within the police force ensuring that Salvatore and his men would be apprehended. Salvatore's face paled. He knew he was trapped. There was no escape. The police arrived, swarming the villa, their presence a stark reminder of the consequences of Salvatore's actions, of the price of betrayal. Salvatore and his men were arrested, taken away in handcuffs, their dreams of power and dominance shattered. Aurora watched them go, her emotions a complex mix of relief, satisfaction, and sadness. She had exposed Salvatore, she had protected her father, she had saved herself. But at what cost? The De Rossi family was fractured, its secrets exposed, its future uncertain. She was an outsider, thrust into a world she didn't understand, a world where loyalty was a fleeting illusion and betrayal a constant threat. She looked at Tommaso, his face etched with exhaustion and concern. He had risked his life for her, he had stood by her, he had declared his love for her.
But what now?
Where did they go from here? Could they build a future together, amidst the ruins of the De Rossi Empire? Could they find happiness in a world consumed by darkness and violence? She reached out, her hand touching his arm. "Tommaso," she said, her voice soft, questioning. He turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and uncertainty. "What happens now, Aurora?" he asked, his voice echoing her own doubts, her own fears. She didn't have the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing. She was no longer alone. She had him. And together, they would face whatever came next. They were at a crossroads, a pivotal moment in their lives, a point where their paths diverged, where they had to make a choice. Stay and fight for the remnants of the De Rossi legacy, a legacy tainted by betrayal and violence. Or leave and forge a new path, a new life, free from the shadows of the past, free from the constraints of family, of duty, of the Mafia. The choice was theirs. And it was a choice that would determine their destiny. He squeezed her hand.
"We have time to decide," he said.
The unspoken question permeated the air around them. Chapter 16. Blood Oaths and Broken Vows. The aftermath of Salvatore's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. Police swarmed the villa, conducting interviews, collecting evidence, piecing together the fragments of Salvatore's failed coup. The news of the betrayal, of the internal power struggle within the De Rossi family, spread like wildfire through the tightly knit community of the Mafia, sending shockwaves through the underworld. Aurora, exhausted and emotionally drained, found herself caught in the middle of the chaos, a reluctant witness to the unraveling of her family's legacy. She answered questions, provided statements, cooperated with the authorities, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Tommaso, about their future, about the impossible choice they faced. Stay or leave, fight or flee, love or duty. Tommaso, ever present, ever protective, remained by her side, shielding her from the prying eyes of the media, from the curious gazes of the family members who had gathered at the villa, a mixture of loyalists and opportunists, vultures circling the carcass of the De Rossi empire. He handled the logistics, dealt with the police, navigated the treacherous currents of Mafia politics, all while keeping a watchful eye on Aurora, ensuring her safety, her well-being. He was her anchor, her rock, her sanctuary in the storm. But he was also a part of this world, a product of its violence, its traditions, its unbreakable codes. Could he ever truly leave it behind? Could she ever truly accept him, knowing his past, knowing the darkness that lurked within him? As the dust began to settle, as the police completed their investigation, As the immediate crisis subsided, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Don Donato, weakened but alive, was transferred to a secure medical facility, his future uncertain. The De Rossi family, fractured and reeling from Salvatore's betrayal, was in disarray, its leadership in question, its power diminished. And Aurora, the reluctant heiress, the outsider thrust into the heart of the storm, was faced with a daunting task: to decide the fate of her family, to choose between her loyalty to her heritage and her desire for a different life, a life free from the shadows of the Mafia. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the Roman skyline, Tommaso found Aurora sitting on the balcony of her father's villa, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He approached her silently, his presence a comforting warmth at her back. He didn't speak, simply stood beside her, sharing the silence, the solitude, the weight of the unspoken questions that hung between them. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally, his voice low and gentle. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I'm thinking about everything," she said. "About my father, about the family, about us." He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a familiar shiver of warmth through her. "What about us, Aurora?" he asked, his voice soft, questioning. She looked at him, her gaze searching his, seeking answers, seeking reassurance. Can we really do this, Tommaso?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Can we have a future together? A normal life, away from all this?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, Aurora," he admitted, his voice honest, vulnerable. "I've lived my whole life in this world. It's all I know. It's in my blood." He paused, his gaze returning to hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "But I also know this," he continued. "I love you, Aurora, more than anything. And I want to be with you, wherever that may be." His words, so simple, so sincere, touched her deeply. She knew he meant them. She knew he loved her. But she also knew that love might not be enough. "But your family," she said, her voice hesitant. "Your obligations, your code. Can you really turn your back on all that?" He sighed, a long, weary sound. "My family, they're not like your father's family," he said. "They're different, more pragmatic. They understand that times are changing, that the old ways are no longer sustainable." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "My cousin, Marco, he's already taken steps to modernize the family business," he continued. "To move away from the violence, the extortion, the traditional mafia activities. He wants to focus on legitimate businesses, on investments, on building a different kind of empire." Aurora was surprised. She had seen Marco as a ruthless, ambitious man, a product of the same world as her father, as Salvatore. But perhaps she had misjudged him. Perhaps there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for change, even within the Mafia. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice soft. "What do you want, Tommaso? Not what your family wants, not what Marco wants. What do you want?" He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a depth of emotion she had never seen before. "I want you, Aurora," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "I want to be with you. I want to build a life with you. A life free from fear, free from violence, free from the shadows of the past." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But I also know that I can't just walk away," he continued. "I have responsibilities. I have obligations. I have debts to repay." He looked at his hands. "I am a part of something, and I must consider what is best for everyone." The statement hung unfinished. A chasm to be crossed. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm of Retribution. Tommaso's words, though filled with love and a longing for a different life, cast a shadow of uncertainty over their future. The debts he spoke of, the unspoken obligations that tied him to his world, were a stark reminder of the forces that threatened to pull them apart. Aurora understood his dilemma. He was torn between his love for her and his loyalty to his family, to his past, to the code he had lived by for so long. It was a conflict that resonated within her as well, A struggle between her desire for a peaceful life and the pull of her own heritage, the responsibility she felt towards her father's legacy, however tainted it might be. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension, an unspoken negotiation between their two worlds. They spent time together, exploring the city, sharing quiet moments, stealing glimpses of a possible future, a life beyond the shadows of the Mafia. But the reality of their situation was never far away. Tommaso continued to meet with Marco, discussing the future of the family business, navigating the complex web of alliances and rivalries, trying to find a way to balance his obligations with his desire for a different life. Aurora, meanwhile, began to delve deeper into her father's affairs, sifting through documents, meeting with advisors, trying to understand the extent of the Derossi Empire, the challenges it faced, the potential for change. She discovered that her father, despite his ruthless reputation, had also been a shrewd businessman, with investments in legitimate enterprises, with a vision for a more modern, less violent future for the family. It was a vision that echoed Marco's ambitions, a vision that offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility of redemption. But the past, like a persistent shadow, refused to stay buried. News of Salvatore's betrayal, of his alliance with the Rizzos, had sent ripples of unrest through the underworld. Old scores needed to be settled, blood debts needed to be repaid. The Rizzos, emboldened by Salvatore's failed coup, saw an opportunity to strike, to weaken the Derossi family, to claim their territory, to finally achieve the dominance they had craved for generations. Rumors of impending attacks, of planned assassinations, of a brewing war between the families, began to circulate. The atmosphere in Rome, already tense, became charged with a palpable sense of danger, of impending violence. Tommaso, aware of the growing threat, became increasingly protective of Aurora, his concern bordering on obsession. He insisted on constant surveillance, on armed guards, on limiting her movements, on keeping her hidden, safe from the storm that was gathering on the horizon. Aurora, initially grateful for his protection, began to feel suffocated, trapped by his constant vigilance, by the restrictions he imposed on her freedom. She understood his fears, his desire to keep her safe, but she also longed for a sense of agency, for a chance to make her own choices, to live her own life. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit study of her father's villa, the tension between them finally erupted. "I can't live like this, Tommaso," she said, her voice strained, her frustration evident. "I feel like a prisoner in my own home." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of concern and anger. "You're not a prisoner, Aurora," he said, his voice sharp. "You're being protected. You don't understand the danger we're in. The Rizzos, they won't hesitate to kill you, to use you as a weapon against your father, against the family." "I understand the danger," she retorted, her voice rising. "But I'm not a child, Tommaso. I'm not a fragile doll that needs to be kept locked away. I can take care of myself." "No, you can't," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You don't know this world. You don't understand the rules. You're naive, Aurora. You're idealistic. And that could get you killed." His words, though spoken out of concern, stung her. She felt a surge of anger, of resentment, at his patronizing tone, at his assumption that she was incapable of handling herself, of understanding the complexities of her own heritage. "I may be naive, Tommaso," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm not weak. And I'm not a coward. I won't hide in the shadows while others fight my battles for me." She stood up, pacing the room, her frustration boiling over. "I want to be a part of this, Tommaso," she continued. "I want to help rebuild the family, to shape its future, to make a difference. But I can't do that if you keep treating me like a child, if you keep me locked away, if you don't trust me." He stood up as well, his expression softening, his anger replaced by a flicker of regret. "I do trust you, Aurora," he said, his voice sincere. "It's not you I don't trust. It's the world we live in. It's the enemies who surround us. It's myself." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I'm afraid, Aurora," he admitted, his voice vulnerable. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of failing to protect you." afraid of the darkness within me. His confession, so raw, so honest, touched her deeply. She understood his fears. She shared them, but she also knew that they couldn't let fear control them, that they couldn't let the darkness consume them. She reached out, her hand touching his cheek. "We'll face it together, Tommaso," she said, her voice soft, reassuring. "We'll fight the darkness together. We'll build a better future together." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, savoring the moment of connection, of shared hope, of love. But the moment was shattered by the sudden, piercing sound of shattering glass, followed by the unmistakable roar of gunfire. The storm had arrived, and it was about to engulf them. The villa shook with the impact. Chapter 18. Hearts entangled, destinies intertwined. The shattering glass and the staccato bursts of gunfire ripped through the fragile piece, plunging them into a maelstrom of chaos and violence. Tommaso reacted instantly, his instincts honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of the Mafia world. He pulled Aurora to the floor, shielding her body with his own, his senses on high alert, assessing the threat, formulating a plan of action. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice low and urgent, his grip on her tight and reassuring. The gunfire continued, sporadic but intense, coming from outside the villa, bullets piercing the windows, shattering furniture, ripping through the walls. The attackers were clearly targeting the study, knowing that Tommaso and Aurora were inside. Tommaso crawled towards the shattered window, peering cautiously through the gaps in the curtains, trying to identify the source of the attack, to assess the number of assailants, their weapons, their position. "It's the Rizzos," he said, his voice grim, confirming their worst fears. "They're trying to take us out, to finish what Salvatore started." Aurora, huddled on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest, felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of clarity. This was it, the moment of truth. The culmination of all the events that had led them to this point, the inevitable clash between their two worlds. She looked at Tommaso, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the dying fire, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, protective intensity. He was a warrior, a protector, a man forged in the crucible of violence. But he was also the man she loved, the man who had shown her tenderness, vulnerability, a longing for a different life. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the terror that gripped her. He didn't answer immediately. He was assessing the situation, calculating the odds, formulating a plan. He retrieved a handgun from a hidden compartment in the wall, checking the ammunition, his movements precise and efficient. "We fight back," he said, his voice low and determined. "We defend ourselves. And we get out of here." He handed her a small, silver pistol, a weapon she had never held before, a symbol of the world she had tried to escape, but now found herself inextricably bound to. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she took the weapon. She had never fired a gun in her life. She was a scholar, an academic, a woman of peace. But she was also a Derasi, and she would not cower in fear. I can learn," she said, her voice firm, resolute. He showed her the basics, how to hold the gun, how to aim, how to pull the trigger. His instructions were brief, concise, focused on survival, not on finesse. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't hesitate. And shoot to kill." His words, so blunt, so brutal, sent a shiver down her spine. But she understood. This was a fight for survival. There was no room for hesitation, for doubt, for mercy. They moved cautiously through the villa, using the shadows for cover, listening for any sign of the attackers, their senses on high alert. The gunfire had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence, a tense anticipation of the next attack. They reached a back entrance, a small door that led to a service courtyard. Tommaso peered outside, checking for any sign of the enemy. The coast seemed clear. "We make a run for it," he said, his voice low. "To the garage. There's a car there. We can escape." He opened the door, pulling her with him, sprinting across the courtyard, their bodies low to the ground, their hearts pounding in unison. But just as they reached the garage, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was a man, tall and muscular, his face obscured by a ski mask, his hands holding a large, automatic rifle. A Rizzo. The man raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Tommaso and Aurora. "It's over, Benedetti," he growled, his voice muffled by the mask. "You're not going anywhere." Tommaso pushed Aurora behind him, shielding her body with his own, his handgun raised, ready to fire. But before he could pull the trigger, Aurora stepped forward, her small silver pistol held firmly in her hand, her aim steady, her gaze unwavering. She fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the courtyard. The masked man staggered backward, his rifle clattering to the ground, his body collapsing in a heap. Aurora stood there, frozen, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the shock of what she had just done. She had killed a man. She had taken a life. Tommaso, stunned by her swift, decisive action, looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. "Aurora," he said, his voice a choked whisper.
She didn't respond.
She couldn't. She was still processing the reality of her actions, the weight of the life she had taken, the irreversible step she had taken into the darkness. He took the gun out of her hands. He then pulled her close and looked directly into her eyes. He saw the cold fire burning and understood. Chapter 19. The Crucible of Sacrifice and Redemption. The echoes of the gunshot faded into the night, leaving a heavy silence in their wake, a silence filled with the weight of Aurora's actions, with the irreversible consequences of the life she had taken. She stood there, numb, her body trembling, her mind struggling to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she had become. Tommaso, his arm protectively around her, guided her into the garage, his senses on high alert, scanning for any further threats. The garage was dimly lit, filled with a scent of gasoline and oil, a stark contrast to the elegant, if now bullet-ridden, villa they had just escaped. He found a car, a powerful, black sedan, its engine purring with barely contained energy. He helped Aurora into the passenger seat, his touch gentle, reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of the trauma she had just experienced. He got behind the wheel, his movements quick and efficient, his focus on escape, on survival. He slammed the car into gear, speeding out of the garage, leaving behind the scene of violence, the shattered remnants of their former lives, the uncertain future that lay ahead. As they drove, Aurora remained silent, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, her mind replaying the events of the past few minutes, the image of the masked man falling, the feel of the gun in her hand, the chilling realization that she had crossed a line, a boundary she could never uncross. Tommaso glanced at her, his concern evident in his eyes. "Aurora," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of tenderness and apprehension. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The words were trapped in her throat, choked by the emotions that surged within her. Fear, guilt, regret, and a strange, unsettling sense of empowerment. I don't know," she said finally, her voice a whisper, her gaze still fixed on the passing darkness. I killed him, Tommaso. I took a life." He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch warm and comforting. "You did what you had to do, Aurora," he said, his voice firm, reassuring. "You protected yourself. You protected us. You were incredible." His words, though meant to comfort her, didn't ease the burden she carried. She had taken a life, and that was something she would have to live with, something that would forever change her, something that would forever haunt her. They drove in silence for a long time, the only sound the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the wipers against the windshield, clearing away the remnants of a light rain that had begun to fall. As they approached the outskirts of Rome, Tommaso pulled the car over to the side of the road, stopping in a secluded area, hidden from view by a cluster of trees. He turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of love, concern, and something else. Something that looked like respect. "We need to talk, Aurora," he said, his voice serious. "About what happened." About what happens next. She nodded, her throat still tight, her emotions raw. She knew they couldn't avoid the conversation, that they had to confront the reality of their situation, the consequences of their actions, the uncertain future that lay ahead. I don't regret it, she said, her voice hesitant, but firm. I would do it again. To protect you. To protect myself. He nodded, his expression understanding.
I know, he said.
And that changes things, Aurora. It changes us. He paused, his gaze holding hers. You've crossed a line, he continued. You're not just an outsider anymore. You're one of us. You're a part of this world, whether you like it or not. His words, though true, sent a shiver of apprehension through her. She had crossed a line. She had become a part of this world, a world of violence, of betrayal, of unbreakable codes. But that doesn't mean we can't have a future together, Aurora, he said, his voice softening, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. It just means our future will be different. More complicated. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I still want to leave, Aurora, he continued. I still want to build a life with you, away from all this. But I can't just abandon my family, my responsibilities. I have to find a way to make things right, to ensure their safety, their future. He took a deep breath, his expression determined. I need to go back, he said. I need to confront the Rizzos. I need to end this, once and for all. Aurora felt a surge of fear, a primal dread of losing him. No, Tommaso, she said, her voice pleading. It's too dangerous. You can't go back there. They'll kill you. He smiled, a sad, tender smile. I have to, Aurora, he said. It's the only way. It's my duty. It's my redemption. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a brief, tender kiss, a silent promise of love, of hope, of a future they might never have. Wait for me, he said, his voice a whisper. Wait for me, Aurora. And I promise you I'll come back. We'll build our life together. Somewhere far away from here. Then he was gone. He got out of the car, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Aurora alone, with her fears, with her doubts, with the uncertain hope that he would return, that they would find their way to a different life, a life beyond the shadows of the Mafia. He left her his phone. And she knew. She knew this was to be his sacrifice. He would face them alone. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The silence that followed Tommaso's departure was deafening, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the car's roof and the frantic beating of Aurora's heart. She sat there, alone in the darkness, clutching Tommaso's phone, her mind reeling, her emotions a chaotic mix of fear, grief, and a desperate, clinging hope. She knew what he was doing. He was sacrificing himself, offering himself as a target, a distraction, to draw the Rizzos away from her, to give her a chance to escape, to build a new life, a life free from the violence and the shadows of the Mafia. It was a noble gesture, a selfless act of love, but it was also reckless, foolish, potentially suicidal. She couldn't let him do it. She couldn't let him face the Rizzos alone. She looked at the phone in her hand, Tommaso's phone, a lifeline, a connection to him, a tool she could use to what? Call for help? Alert the authorities? Contact Marco?
No.
None of those options felt right. The police were corrupt, unreliable, potentially in league with the Rizzos. Marco, despite his apparent support, was still an unknown quantity, a man with his own ambitions, his own agenda. She was alone. She had to rely on herself, on her own instincts, on her own strength. She remembered the GPS tracker, hidden in the lining of her handbag. Tommaso had insisted on it, a precaution, a way to monitor her movements, to ensure her safety. But now, it could be used for a different purpose. It could be used to track him, to find him, to help him. She found the small, discreet device, activating it, her fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She connected it to Tommaso's phone, accessing the tracking data, her heart pounding in her chest. A small dot appeared on the screen, a blinking beacon representing Tommaso's location. He was moving, heading back towards the city, back towards the heart of the danger, back towards the Rizzos. She had to go after him. She had to stop him, to help him, to save him. She started the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her mind focused on one thing, finding Tommaso. She drove through the night, following the blinking dot on the phone screen, navigating the dark, rain-slicked streets of Rome, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. The tracker led her to a warehouse district, a desolate, industrial area on the outskirts of the city, a place of shadows and secrets, a place where deals were made and lives were ended. She parked the car a short distance from the warehouse indicated on the screen, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to run, to escape. But she couldn't. She had to find Tommaso. She got out of the car, her hand reaching for the small, silver pistol tucked into her waistband, the weapon that had become a symbol of her transformation, of her entry into this world of violence and darkness. She approached the warehouse cautiously, her senses on high alert, listening for any sound, any sign of movement, any indication of danger. The warehouse was large, dark, and silent, its windows boarded up, its doors secured. It looked abandoned, deserted, but Aurora knew better. She could feel it, a palpable sense of tension, of anticipation, of impending violence. She found a side entrance, a small, metal door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand gripping the pistol, her senses on high alert. She stepped inside, entering a vast, dimly lit space, filled with crates, machinery, and the lingering scent of decay and chemicals. The air was thick with a sense of menace, of hidden dangers, of unspoken threats. She moved cautiously through the warehouse, using the shadows for cover, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. Then she heard it, a muffled shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle, of bodies colliding, of fists striking flesh. The sound was coming from the far end of the warehouse, from a large, open area, illuminated by a single, flickering light bulb. She crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand gripping the pistol, her senses on high alert. She reached the edge of the open area, peering cautiously around a stack of crates. And then she saw him, Tommaso. He was surrounded by Rizzos, 5 of them, armed with knives, clubs, and guns. He was fighting them, his movements fierce and desperate, his body battered and bruised, his clothes torn and bloodied. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he was not defeated. He was fighting with the courage of a cornered lion, with the desperation of a man fighting for his life, for his love, for his future. Aurora watched, her heart breaking at the sight of his struggle, her mind racing, trying to find a way to help him, to save him. She couldn't stand by and watch him die. She had to do something. She stepped out from behind the crates, her pistol raised, her aim steady, her gaze unwavering. "Let him go," she shouted, her voice echoing through the warehouse, her voice filled with a newfound strength, a newfound authority, a newfound power. The Rizzos, surprised by her sudden appearance, turned to face her, their expressions a mixture of shock and amusement. Tommaso, seeing her, his eyes widened with a mixture of relief and fear. "Aurora no," he shouted, his voice strained, his body weakened by the fight. "Get out of here. Run." But she didn't run. She stood her ground, her pistol trained on the Rizzos, her gaze unwavering. "I said, let him go," she repeated, her voice firm, resolute. "Or I'll shoot." The Rizzos laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the warehouse. "You, and what army, little girl?" One of them sneered, his hand tightening around his knife. Aurora didn't answer. She simply fired. She hit 1, then 2. Tommaso took the opportunity to finish the fight. When the dust settled, only Tommaso and Aurora were left standing. He walked to her and held her. They had both crossed the line. They were both changed. Epilogue. The echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by a heavy, profound silence. The warehouse, once a stage for violence and confrontation, was now a scene of stillness, of fallen bodies, of shattered ambitions, of a love that had been tested and proven in the crucible of fire. Aurora stood there, her body trembling, her mind reeling, the pistol still clutched in her hand, the weight of her actions, of the lives she had taken, pressing down on her. She had killed again. She had become a part of this world, a world she had always despised, a world she had hoped to escape. Tommaso, battered and bruised, but alive, approached her slowly, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and love. He reached out, his hand gently taking the pistol from her, his touch a silent reassurance, a grounding presence in the chaos of her emotions. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, his body a shield against the darkness, against the horrors they had just witnessed. "It's over, Aurora," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his breath warm on her hair. "It's finally over." She leaned into him, her body shaking, her tears flowing freely, a release of all the pent-up fear, the tension, the grief, the love that had sustained her through the ordeal. They stood there for a long time, silent, connected, their hearts beating in unison, their bodies intertwined, drawing strength and comfort from each other. The world outside, with its complexities, its dangers, its uncertainties, faded away, replaced by the overwhelming presence of each other, of the love that had bound them together, of the future they had fought for, a future they would now face together. The aftermath was a blur of activity, police investigations, legal proceedings, the dismantling of the Rizzo family, the restructuring of the Derossi Empire under Marco's leadership. Aurora and Tommaso cooperated with the authorities, providing their testimonies, ensuring that justice was served, that the cycle of violence was broken. Donato Derossi, weakened but aware of the events that had transpired, expressed his gratitude to Tommaso, his pride in Aurora, his acceptance of their love, his blessing for their future together. He died a few weeks later, peacefully, in his sleep, his legacy secured, his daughter safe, his family on a new path, a path towards a different kind of future. Aurora and Tommaso, finally free from the shadows of the Mafia, made a choice. They left Rome, leaving behind the violence, the betrayal, the unbreakable codes, the weight of their respective legacies. They chose a different life, a life of peace, of anonymity, of simple pleasures, of a love that had been forged in fire, a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. They settled in a small, quiet village in Tuscany, far from the bustling city, far from the echoes of their past. They bought a small vineyard, a place where they could work the land, where they could connect with nature, where they could build a new life, a life rooted in love, in trust, in a shared dream of a peaceful future. They spent their days tending to the vines, harvesting the grapes, making wine, sharing quiet moments, building a home, a sanctuary, a place where they could heal, where they could grow old together, where they could finally be free. Years passed. The scars of the past remained, a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced, of the sacrifices they had made, of the love that had sustained them. But the scars had faded, becoming a part of their story, a testament to their resilience, to their strength, to their unwavering commitment to each other. They had children, and then grandchildren, filling their lives with laughter, with joy, with the simple pleasures of family, of connection, of a love that spanned generations. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan hills, Aurora and Tommaso sat together on the porch of their villa, their hands clasped, their bodies close, their hearts filled with a quiet contentment. They looked at each other, their eyes meeting, their gaze filled with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had conquered darkness, a love that had found its way to the light. "We made it," Tommaso, Aurora said, her voice soft, her smile tender. He nodded, his gray eyes twinkling with a love that had never faded, a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. "We did, Dolcezza," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "We made it together." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the Tuscan landscape, by the warmth of their love, by the promise of a peaceful future, They knew that they had found their true home, their true sanctuary, their true destiny. A destiny intertwined, a love eternal, a life reborn. They raised there,